Dr. Sarah Chen had always believed that healing knew no boundaries. At 34, she had already spent 8 years working in war zones across 3 continents, but nothing had prepared her for what she would face in the mountains of Afghanistan. The call came on a Tuesday morning while she was reviewing medical supplies at the field hospital in Kabul. "We need you to accompany a rescue mission," Colonel Martinez said, his weathered face showing the strain of too many sleepless nights. "There's a village about 40 miles north. Intel suggests civilians are trapped after a Taliban attack 3 days ago." Sarah looked up from her inventory clipboard. The fluorescent lights of the medical tent cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the determination that had carried her through medical school and into some of the world's most dangerous places. She had joined Doctors Without Borders not for glory or recognition, but because she genuinely believed that every life had value, regardless of which side of a conflict they found themselves on. "What's the situation?" she asked, already knowing she would accept the mission before hearing the details. The colonel spread a map across the metal table between them. His finger traced a route through mountainous terrain marked with red zones indicating heavy fighting. "Village called Khost Matun, population about 800. 3 days ago, Taliban fighters moved through the area. There was resistance from local militia. When our drones flew over yesterday, we spotted what looked like survivors signaling for help." Sarah studied the map carefully. The village sat in a valley surrounded by steep hills, accessible only through narrow passes that could easily become death traps. The nearest coalition base was over 60 miles away, and the terrain would make helicopter extraction nearly impossible in most areas. "What about the SEAL team?" she asked, noticing the military designations marked around the target area. "Team 7 will provide security and extraction support," Martinez explained. 6 operators, all experienced in mountain warfare. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "This isn't a standard medical evacuation. The intelligence is sketchy at best. We don't know exactly what you'll find when you get there." The next morning, Sarah found herself sitting in the back of an armored vehicle, bouncing along a dirt road that seemed to disappear into the mountains ahead. Beside her sat Chief Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez, the team leader of SEAL Team 7. He was a compact man in his early 30s, with steady hands and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him simultaneously. "First time working with SEALs?" Rodriguez asked as they navigated another sharp turn. "Second," Sarah replied, checking her medical kit for the 3rd time that morning. "But the last time was a straightforward evacuation." "This feels different," Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "It is different. The Taliban has been using this area as a staging ground for attacks on coalition convoys. They know we're coming, and they know why we're coming. The question is whether they'll try to stop us or use the situation to their advantage." The other team members introduced themselves as the vehicle climbed higher into the mountains. There was Johnson, the team's medic and explosives expert; Patel, their communications specialist; Williams, the sniper; Casey, the youngest member who specialized in close-quarters combat; and Thompson, a veteran with more deployments than he cared to count. As they approached the last checkpoint before entering the danger zone, Rodriguez gathered everyone for a final briefing. The mountain air was thin and cold despite the afternoon sun, and Sarah could see her breath as she listened to the tactical overview. "Remember, our primary mission is to get Dr. Chen in and out safely, while she provides medical assistance to any survivors," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "Secondary objective is intelligence gathering about Taliban movements in the area. We stay together, we watch each other's backs, and nobody plays hero." Sarah adjusted her body armor, still not completely comfortable with the weight of it. She had worn protective gear before, but something about this mission felt heavier, more ominous. The mountains around them seemed to lean inward, creating shadows that could hide anything or anyone. "What if we encounter Taliban fighters?" she asked, the question that had been nagging at her since they left base. "We avoid contact if possible," Rodriguez replied. "But if we can't avoid it, you stay down and let us handle it. Your job is to save lives. Our job is to make sure you live long enough to do it." The final stretch of the journey took them along a ridge that offered a clear view of the valley below. Through binoculars, Sarah could see Khost Matun spread out like a collection of scattered toys. Smoke was still rising from several buildings, and the streets appeared eerily empty. What should have been a bustling village in the middle of the day looked more like a ghost town. There, Williams pointed to a cluster of buildings near the center of the village. Movement in that compound. Looks like survivors trying to signal. Rodriguez studied the scene through his own binoculars. I count at least 15 people, maybe more. They're gathered around what looks like a damaged building. Could be injured civilians. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the reality of the situation settled in. Somewhere down in that village were people who needed help. People who had been waiting for 3 days for someone to come. She thought about the families who might be trapped, the children who might be scared and hurt, the elderly who might not survive another night without medical attention. How do we get down there? She asked, already planning the medical supplies she would need for different scenarios. There's a path that leads down from the north side of the valley, Rodriguez explained, pointing to a barely visible track that wound down the mountainside. It's exposed, but it's our best option for getting close without being detected from the main village approaches. As they prepared to begin their descent, Sarah took one last look at the village below. She had no way of knowing that in less than 6 hours, she would make a decision that would change not only her own life, but the lives of everyone on both sides of a conflict that had already claimed too many victims. All she knew was that people needed help, and she had the skills to provide it. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountain peaks as they started down the narrow path toward Coast Matun, each step taking them deeper into a situation that would test everything they believed about duty, courage, and the value of human life. The descent into the valley took longer than anyone had anticipated. The path was treacherous, carved into the mountainside generations ago, by people who understood that sometimes the most dangerous route was also the safest. Sarah followed closely behind Rodriguez, her medical pack weighing heavily on her shoulders as they navigated loose rocks and steep drops. Every few hundred yards, the team would stop and scan the valley below through their scopes. The village remained eerily quiet, with only occasional movement visible near the central compound where they had spotted the survivors. The damaged buildings cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun, creating a maze of potential hiding places that made everyone nervous. "Contact," whispered Patel, who was monitoring radio frequencies. "Taliban chatter on the eastern ridge. Sounds like they're discussing movement in the village." Rodriguez held up his hand and the entire team froze in place. Sarah found herself crouched behind a large boulder, her heart pounding as she listened to the SEALs communicate through hand signals. The reality of their situation was becoming clearer with each passing minute. They weren't just on a rescue mission. They were walking into the middle of an active combat zone. "How many?" Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "Unclear," Patel responded. "At least 6, maybe more. They're positioned on the high ground overlooking the village from the east." Sarah peered around the boulder toward the village below. From their current position, she could see the compound more clearly. The people gathered there weren't just survivors. They were families. She could make out children among the group, and what looked like an elderly man sitting against a wall. Her medical training kicked in, and she began mentally cataloging the supplies she would need for different types of injuries. Williams, the team's sniper, had found a position with a clear view of the eastern ridge. After several minutes of careful observation, he reported back. "I've got eyes on 4 Taliban fighters, 2 with AK-47s, 1 with what looks like an RPG, and 1 with a radio. They're about 800 meters from the village center. Are they watching us or the village?" Rodriguez asked. "Both," Williams replied grimly. "They've got overwatch on all the approaches. If we continue down this path, they'll spot us within the next 5 minutes. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. The people in the village had been waiting for help for 3 days. Every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death for someone who was seriously injured. But she also understood that rushing into a trap would help no one. "What are our options?" she asked quietly. Rodriguez studied the terrain ahead through his binoculars. "We can wait for dark, try to approach under cover of darkness, or we can find another route which would add at least 4 hours to our timeline." "What about a direct approach?" Sarah suggested. "If I go in openly as a medical worker, maybe they won't see me as a threat." The look Rodriguez gave her suggested he thought she had lost her mind. "Doc, these aren't regular soldiers following rules of engagement. They've been known to target medical personnel specifically." Johnson, the team medic, moved closer to where Sarah was crouched. "I've worked with Taliban fighters before," he said quietly.
"Some groups respect medical neutrality, others don't. The problem is,
You never know which kind you're dealing with until it's too late." As they debated their options, Movement in the village caught everyone's attention. A group of 3 people had separated from the main gathering and were walking toward the edge of the village, directly toward a building that showed significant damage from the recent fighting. "They're moving toward the school," Rodriguez observed, checking the intel photos they had brought. "That building took a direct hit from an RPG 3 days ago. If anyone's trapped in there..." Sarah grabbed her binoculars and focused on the group approaching the damaged building. One person was limping heavily, supported by the other 2. Even from this distance, she could tell they were struggling to move the injured person. "They need help now," she said, the urgency clear in her voice. "Whoever's injured isn't going to last much longer." Williams continued monitoring the Taliban positions. "They're moving," he reported. 2 fighters are heading down toward the village from the east. The other 2 are staying in overwatch positions. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah watched as the 3 villagers reached the damaged school building and began trying to move debris from what appeared to be a collapsed doorway. It was clear they were attempting a rescue of their own, trying to reach someone trapped inside the building. "Chief," Casey spoke up from his position further down the path, "I've got movement from the south. Looks like more villagers, maybe 6 or 7 people, heading toward the school from the opposite direction." Sarah realized what was happening. The entire village was converging on the school building, probably because someone important was trapped inside. A teacher maybe, or a local leader. The people were risking their own safety to attempt a rescue, and they were about to walk directly into the line of fire from the Taliban fighters approaching from the east. "We have to warn them," Sarah said, starting to stand up from her position behind the boulder. Rodriguez grabbed her arm firmly. "Doc, if we reveal our position now, we're all dead. Those fighters on the ridge will cut us down before we make it 50 yards. But if we don't do something, we're about to watch a massacre," Sarah replied, her voice tight with frustration. "Those villagers have no idea what's coming." Thompson, the veteran operator, had been quietly observing the entire situation. "There might be a way," he said slowly. "If we create a distraction on the western side of the valley, draw the Taliban fighters away from the village, the doc might have a chance to reach the civilians." "What kind of distraction?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Controlled explosion on the ridge about half a mile west of here," Thompson explained. "Make it look like a coalition airstrike. The Taliban fighters will either retreat or move to investigate. Either way, it gives us a window." Sarah looked down at the village, where more people were now moving toward the damaged school. Time was running out for whoever was trapped inside that building, and for the villagers who were unknowingly walking into danger. "How long would the window last?" she asked. "Maybe 10 minutes, Thompson replied. 15 if we're lucky." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks. "If this goes wrong, we could end up trapped in the valley with no way out." Sarah met his eyes. "If we don't try, we're definitely going to watch people die who we could have saved." The weight of command showed on Rodriguez's face as he made the decision that would change everything. "Thompson, prep the charges. Williams, keep eyes on those fighters. Patel, monitor all frequencies. And Doc..." He looked directly at Sarah. "When that explosion goes off, you'll have maybe 12 minutes to get to that village and back. No heroes, no extended medical procedures. You stabilize whoever needs help and we extract immediately." As Thompson began preparing the explosive charges that would create their distraction, Sarah rechecked her medical supplies one final time. She had no way of knowing that the person trapped in that school building would change everything she thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true cost of war. The explosion echoed across the valley like thunder, sending a plume of smoke and debris high into the late afternoon sky. Sarah felt the shockwave roll over them even from their position nearly a mile away from Thompson's carefully placed charges. The sound bounced off the mountain walls, creating multiple echoes that made it impossible to determine exactly where the blast had originated. "Go, go, go," Rodriguez whispered urgently into his radio, as the Taliban fighters on the eastern ridge immediately began moving toward the explosion site. Sarah was already running down the steep path toward the village, her medical pack bouncing against her back with each step. Behind her, she could hear the SEALs moving into position to provide covering fire if needed. The plan was simple: get to the trapped civilians, provide immediate medical aid, and get out before the Taliban fighters realized they had been deceived. The distance to the village seemed much greater when she was running it alone. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. Every sound could signal the end of their brief window of opportunity. Sarah's training had prepared her for working under pressure, but nothing had quite prepared her for the combination of combat stress and the desperate need to reach people who needed medical help. As she approached the outskirts of the village, the first villagers spotted her. A woman carrying a small child pointed in her direction and called out in Pashto. Sarah didn't speak the language fluently, but she recognized the word for doctor. Word spread quickly among the gathered civilians, and by the time she reached the damaged school building, nearly 20 people had surrounded her. The scene was worse than she had expected. The school had taken a direct hit from an RPG, collapsing most of the front wall and trapping several people inside. The villagers had been working with their bare hands to move debris, but the twisted metal and heavy concrete blocks required more than human strength to shift. An elderly man who appeared to be a village leader approached her, speaking rapidly in Pashto while gesturing toward the collapsed building. Sarah caught enough words to understand that there were at least 3 people trapped inside: a teacher, a teenage girl, and an elderly woman who had been seeking shelter when the attack occurred. "I need tools," Sarah said, pointing to the debris and miming lifting motions. "Heavy tools, ropes, anything that can move these blocks." The villagers scattered quickly, returning within minutes with whatever they could find: crowbars, shovels, pieces of rope, and even a car jack that someone had retrieved from a nearby garage. Working together, they began the careful process of creating an opening large enough for Sarah to reach the trapped civilians. Through her radio earpiece, she could hear Rodriguez providing updates on the tactical situation. "Doc, you've got about 8 minutes before those fighters figure out the explosion was a diversion. How's the rescue progressing?" "We're making progress," Sarah replied quietly, trying not to alarm the villagers around her. "I can hear voices from inside. At least 2 people are still alive." The breakthrough came when they managed to shift a large concrete beam that had been supporting most of the debris pile. Suddenly there was a gap large enough for Sarah to squeeze through. Without hesitation, she grabbed her medical kit and crawled into the darkness of the collapsed building. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of smoke. Sarah used her flashlight to navigate through the rubble, following the sound of voices toward the back of the building. What she found there would stay with her for the rest of her life. The teacher, a woman in her 40s named Miriam, had positioned herself over the teenage girl and elderly woman, using her own body to create a protective space when the ceiling collapsed. Her legs were trapped under a heavy beam and she was clearly in severe pain, but she had maintained consciousness and continued talking to keep the others calm. "American doctor?" Miriam asked in accented English when she saw Sarah's uniform. "Yes," Sarah replied, immediately beginning her medical assessment. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" The teenage girl, who couldn't have been more than 16, had a severe laceration on her arm and possible internal injuries from the impact. The elderly woman appeared to have suffered a broken hip and was showing signs of shock. But it was Miriam's condition that concerned Sarah most. The beam across her legs had likely caused significant crush injuries, and moving her incorrectly could be fatal. Through her earpiece, Rodriguez's voice carried new urgency. "Doc, the Taliban fighters are heading back toward the village. You need to wrap this up in the next 4 minutes." Sarah worked quickly, starting IVs on all 3 patients and administering pain medication to make them more comfortable. The teenage girl was stable enough to be moved immediately, but Miriam and the elderly woman would require more time and careful extraction. "I need to move this beam," Sarah called out to the villagers who were watching anxiously from the opening. "But I need more people to help lift it safely." Within seconds, 6 villagers had squeezed into the cramped space, positioning themselves around the heavy beam. Sarah explained what they needed to do, using a combination of English, gestures, and the few Pashto words she knew. They would lift the beam together while she pulled Miriam to safety. 3 minutes, Doc." Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece. "We've got movement on the eastern approach to the village." The lift went perfectly. The villagers raised the beam just enough for Sarah to slide Miriam out from underneath it, carefully supporting her legs to prevent further damage. The teacher was conscious but weak, and Sarah could see that the crush injuries were severe. Without immediate surgery, Miriam would likely lose her legs, but she would survive. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah prepared all 3 patients for transport. The teenage girl could walk with assistance, the elderly woman would need to be carried, and Miriam would require a stretcher. The villagers had already anticipated this, arriving with makeshift stretchers constructed from doors and blankets. 2 minutes, Rodriguez warned. I can see muzzle flashes on the ridge. They're engaging something, probably trying to draw us out. As they moved the patients toward the village center where the SEALs were waiting, Sarah realized that the extraction was only half the problem. They still had to get everyone up the mountain path and to the extraction point, all while potentially under fire from Taliban fighters, who would soon discover that the explosion had been a ruse on the villagers who had helped her, with the rescue gathered around Sarah as they reached the meeting point. The village leader, an elderly man named Haji Abdul, spoke to her in careful English. Doctor, thank you for coming for our people, but you must know the Taliban fighters, they will return soon. They will be angry about the explosion. They will punish the village. Sarah felt her heart sink as the implications of Haji Abdul's words became clear. By helping create the diversion that allowed her to reach the trapped civilians, the SEALs had inadvertently put the entire village at risk of retaliation. The Taliban would assume the villagers had cooperated with American forces, and the consequences could be severe. Rodriguez and his team appeared at the edge of the village center, moving quickly but carefully to avoid detection. Doc, we need to move now, he called out quietly. Those fighters will be back in position within the next few minutes. But as Sarah looked around at the faces of the people who had risked their own safety to help her save 3 lives, she realized that their mission had become much more complicated than a simple medical rescue. The choice she would make in the next 60 seconds would determine not just the fate of her patients, but the fate of an entire village that had shown extraordinary courage in the face of danger. Sarah stared at the faces surrounding her in the village center, each one showing a mixture of hope and fear that cut straight to her heart. The 3 rescued patients were stable for the moment, but they needed immediate evacuation to receive proper medical care. At the same time, the 37 villagers gathered around them would face almost certain retaliation once the Taliban fighters discovered what had happened. Doc, we have to go, Rodriguez urged, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility. Every second we stay here increases the risk for everyone. Through her earpiece, Sarah could hear Williams providing updates from his overwatch position. Movement on multiple approaches. I count at least 8 fighters converging on the village from 3 different directions. We've got maybe 90 seconds before they're in effective firing range. The village leader, Haji Abdul, approached Sarah one final time. His weathered hands shook slightly as he spoke, but his voice remained steady. Dr. Chen, you have saved our people today. But when you leave, the Taliban will come for all of us. They will say we helped Americans. They will make examples. Sarah's medical training had taught her to make quick decisions under pressure, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The oath she had taken as a doctor required her to do no harm. But every option available seemed to guarantee harm to someone. If she left with the SEALs, the villagers would face brutal retaliation. If she stayed, she would be putting not just herself at risk, but the entire SEAL team as well. There has to be another way, she said, looking between Rodriguez and Haji Abdul. What if we take everyone? The whole village? Rodriguez shook his head grimly. Doc, we've got 1 extraction route and maybe 40 minutes of darkness to work with. There's no way to move 37 people up that mountain path without being detected. Patel's voice crackled through the radio with increasing urgency. Chief, Taliban radio chatter is getting heavy. They're coordinating a sweep of the village. Multiple teams moving in from the north and east. Sarah looked down at Miriam, the teacher who had protected 2 other people with her own body. Despite her injuries, Miriam was conscious and had been listening to the conversation. In broken English, she spoke directly to Sarah. Doctor, you must go. Take the old woman and the girl. I will tell Taliban that explosion was accident, maybe gas line or old ammunition. Village people will support this story. That won't work, Sarah replied gently. They'll know it was a military-grade explosive. They'll know Americans were here. The sound of gunfire echoed from the eastern edge of the village, followed immediately by Williams's voice on the radio. Contact, contact. 3 fighters approaching the school building. They're examining the explosion site. Rodriguez made the command decision that Sarah had been dreading. We're leaving now. Johnson, Casey, prepare to move the patients. Williams, Thompson, cover our withdrawal. Doc, grab your gear. But Sarah didn't move toward her medical pack. Instead, she turned to face Rodriguez directly, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. I'm not leaving. What? Rodriguez couldn't hide his shock. These people helped us save 3 lives, Sarah explained quickly. If we abandon them now, the Taliban will kill or torture dozens of people. I can't live with that. Doc, you can't save everyone, Rodriguez said, his frustration clear. Our job is to get you and the patients out alive. My job is to do no harm, Sarah replied firmly. Leaving these people to die would cause more harm than I can accept. More gunfire erupted, closer this time. Through the darkness, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions around the village. The Taliban fighters had arrived and were beginning to search building by building. Johnson had finished preparing the patients for transport, but he looked up at Sarah with understanding in his eyes. As the team medic, he knew the weight of medical responsibility better than the others. Doc, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that if I stay and treat their wounded when the fighting starts, if I make it clear that I'm here as a neutral medical worker, maybe they'll let the villagers live. That's a hell of a maybe, Thompson observed grimly. William's voice came through the radio again. Chief, we've got a problem. The fighters aren't just searching the village. They're setting up fighting positions. Looks like they're planning to stay. Sarah realized that the situation had moved beyond a simple rescue mission. The Taliban weren't just investigating the explosion. They were establishing control over the village. That meant the villagers were in danger regardless of what had happened today. Rodriguez was studying her face, trying to read her intentions. Doc, if you stay here, we can't provide support. The terrain won't allow us to maintain overwatch, and we can't risk a full engagement with unknown enemy numbers. I understand, Sarah said, but I also understand that these people showed incredible courage today. The least I can do is stay with them. Haji Abdul stepped forward, speaking directly to Rodriguez. Commander, please take Doctor with you. We have lived with Taliban before. We will find way to live with them again. Sarah shook her head. No, you helped me save lives today. Now it's my turn to help you. The fighting was getting closer, and Rodriguez faced an impossible decision. His mission was to protect Sarah, but she was refusing to be protected. His training told him to extract her by force if necessary. But his experience told him that sometimes the best military decision wasn't the right human decision. Casey suddenly appeared at the edge of the village center, breathing hard from running. Chief, we've got multiple teams of fighters surrounding the village. They're not just searching anymore. They're preparing for a siege. How many? Rodriguez asked. At least 20, maybe more. And they've got heavy weapons positioned on the high ground. Sarah looked around at the villagers, many of whom were now gathering their families and preparing for whatever was about to happen. Children were being moved to the center of the group while the men were checking what few weapons they had available. They're going to fight, she realized. The villagers are going to fight back. Rodriguez followed her gaze and came to the same conclusion. And they're going to get slaughtered. The moment of decision had arrived. Sarah could leave with the SEALs and the rescued patients, ensuring their safety while abandoning the villagers to face overwhelming odds. Or she could stay and try to help, knowing that her presence might make the difference between a massacre and a negotiated peace. But as she looked into the eyes of the people who had risked everything to help her save 3 lives, Sarah realized that the decision had already been made. She couldn't walk away from people who had shown such courage regardless of the consequences. Rodriguez, she said quietly, I need you to take the patients and get them to safety, but I'm staying here. The SEAL team leader stared at her for a long moment, understanding finally dawning on his face. He had worked with enough medics to know that when they made this kind of decision, nothing would change their minds, Doc, he said finally. You know we can't come back for you if this goes wrong. I know, Sarah replied. But some things are more important than going home. The SEAL team withdrew into the darkness with their 3 patients, leaving Sarah alone in the center of Coast Mattoon as gunfire echoed from the surrounding hills. The villagers had taken defensive positions around the edges of the settlement, but Sarah knew they were outgunned and outnumbered. What they needed wasn't more weapons. They needed someone who could speak for them when the fighting stopped. Haji Abdul approached her one final time, his face grave in the flickering light from a small fire the villagers had built in the center of their defensive circle. Doctor, you should not have stayed. This is not your fight. Yes, it is, Sarah replied, checking her medical supplies one more time. The moment you helped me save those people, it became my fight too. The old man studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. My son fought with Americans in Helmand province. He said American soldiers understand honor. I see now he was right. Over the next hour, the sound of gunfire gradually decreased as both sides settled into defensive positions. The Taliban fighters had surrounded the village but weren't launching a direct assault. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps reinforcements or perhaps simply for the villagers to surrender. Sarah used the relative quiet to prepare for what she knew was coming. She set up a makeshift medical station in the village's small mosque, the one building that both sides might respect as neutral ground. Her supplies were limited, but she organized them efficiently. Bandages, antibiotics, morphine for pain management, and surgical instruments for emergency procedures. As dawn approached, a voice called out from the darkness beyond the village perimeter. Someone was speaking in Pashto, too quickly and from too far away for Sarah to understand. But the effect on the villagers was immediate. Several of the men lowered their weapons slightly, and Haji Abdul walked toward the edge of the defensive perimeter. "What are they saying?" Sarah asked one of the younger villagers who spoke better English. "They want to talk," the young man replied. "They are asking for village leaders to come out and negotiate." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was the moment she had been preparing for, though she still wasn't sure exactly what she planned to say or do. "I'm going with him," she announced. Several villagers immediately protested, but Sarah was already walking toward the perimeter. "Tell them an American doctor wants to talk," she called back. "Tell them I'm here to treat wounded, not to fight." Haji Abdul caught up with her at the edge of the village. Together, they walked slowly across the open ground toward a position where several Taliban fighters had emerged from behind cover. Sarah kept her hands clearly visible and her medical bag prominently displayed, hoping the universal symbol of medical neutrality would provide some protection. The Taliban commander who met them was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in his late 20s with intelligent eyes and a carefully groomed beard. He spoke fluent English, which surprised her. "I am Commander Habib," he said formally. "You are the American doctor who helped rescue people from the school?" "I am Dr. Sarah Chen," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I came here to provide medical assistance to injured civilians." Habib studied her carefully. "And yet you stayed when your soldiers left. Why?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "Because these people helped me save lives. Because I believe that healing people is more important than politics or war." "Your soldiers killed 4 of my men with their explosion," Habib said, his voice hardening. "They used deception and trickery. These villagers helped them." "The villagers didn't know about any explosion," Sarah replied firmly. "They only knew that people were trapped and needed help. They helped because that's what decent people do." Habib was quiet for several moments, studying both Sarah and Haji Abdul. Finally, he spoke again. "Dr. Chen, why should I believe that you are neutral when you came here with American soldiers?" This was the question Sarah had been dreading, because she didn't have a good answer. She had come with the SEALs. She was American military medical personnel, and she had been part of the operation that resulted in the deaths of Taliban fighters. By any reasonable definition, she was not neutral. "You shouldn't believe I'm neutral," she said finally. "But you should believe that I'm a doctor, and that I'll treat anyone who needs medical help regardless of which side they're on." Habib raised an eyebrow at this unexpected honesty. "You would treat my wounded fighters? If they need medical attention, yes. Even though we are your enemies?" Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "I don't think anyone has to be my enemy. I think we're all just people trying to survive in a complicated world." For the first time since the conversation began, Habib smiled slightly. "That is a very American answer, Dr. Chen. Idealistic, but perhaps not entirely foolish." The young Taliban commander looked around at the village, taking in the defensive positions the villagers had established and the obvious determination on their faces. These people have lived here for generations. They have survived Soviet occupation, civil war, and now American occupation. They are survivors. They're also good people, Sarah added. They risked their own safety to help me save 3 lives today. That's not about politics or war. That's about basic human decency. Habib nodded slowly. And yet they helped American soldiers enter this valley. They helped you create a diversion that killed my men. There must be consequences. Sarah felt her heart sink, but she wasn't ready to give up. What kind of consequences? That depends, Habib replied. On what you are willing to do to protect them. The question hung in the morning air like smoke from the dying fires around the village. Sarah realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward, Whatever Habib was about to propose would determine whether the people of Coast Matun lived or died. "What do you want?" she asked. Habib gestured toward the hills around the village. "I have 23 fighters under my command. 3 were wounded in the fighting last night. If you treat their injuries, if you show that American medical personnel can provide aid without regard to politics, then perhaps the villagers' cooperation with your soldiers can be overlooked." Sarah felt a surge of hope but also suspicion. "And if I refuse? Then the villagers will be held responsible for helping enemy forces operate in this area. The consequences for such cooperation are well established." The threat was clear, but so was the opportunity. If Sarah could demonstrate medical neutrality by treating Taliban fighters, she might be able to save the entire village from retaliation. But she would also be crossing a line that could have serious consequences for her own future. "If I agree to treat your wounded," she said carefully, "what guarantee do I have that you'll honor your agreement to leave the villagers alone?" Habib smiled again, this time with what seemed like genuine respect. "Dr. Chen, in this part of the world, a man's word is the only guarantee that matters. I give you my word that if you treat my fighters, the villagers will be safe." Sarah looked back at the village where 37 people were waiting to learn their fate. Then she looked at Habib, trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. Finally, she made the decision that would define the rest of her life. "Show me to your wounded," she said simply. As they walked toward the Taliban positions in the hills above the village, Sarah realized that she was about to cross a line that most people would never understand. She was about to provide medical care to fighters who had been trying to kill American soldiers just hours before, but she was also about to save the lives of people who had shown extraordinary courage in helping her save others. The Taliban fighters watched in stunned silence as Sarah worked to save the life of their wounded commander's brother. The young man had taken shrapnel in his chest during the night's fighting, and without immediate surgery he would die within the hour. Working by the light of a kerosene lantern in a cave high above Coast Matun, Sarah performed emergency surgery with instruments designed for field medicine, not major operations. "Hold this," she instructed one of the fighters, guiding his hands to maintain pressure on a bleeding artery, while she worked to remove the metal fragments from around the wounded man's heart. The fighter's hands shook initially, but steadied as he realized the importance of his role. Commander Habib stood at the entrance to the cave, watching every movement as Sarah fought to save his brother's life. "In Peshawar, I studied engineering," he said quietly. "I wanted to build schools and hospitals. But war changes everything, doesn't it, Dr. Chen?" "It doesn't have to," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "We can choose how we respond to war. We can choose to heal instead of harm." The surgery took 3 hours. When it was finished, Habib's brother was stable but weak, his breathing steady and his pulse strong. The 2 other wounded fighters had required less intensive care, one with a severe leg wound and another with a concussion from an explosion. By the time Sarah finished treating all 3 patients, the sun was high overhead, and the entire dynamic of the situation had changed. Word of what had happened spread quickly through both the Taliban fighters and the villagers below. An American doctor had risked her own life to save Taliban fighters, demonstrating the kind of medical neutrality that both sides could respect. More importantly, she had proven that healing could transcend the boundaries of conflict. "Your brother will live," Sarah told Habib as she packed up her medical equipment, "but he needs to rest for at least a week, and he'll need antibiotics to prevent infection." Habib nodded, his eyes showing an emotion that Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Dr. Chen, what you have done today, it is not something that will be forgotten." "I just did what any doctor would do," Sarah replied. "I treated people who needed help." "No," Habib said firmly. "What you did required courage that most people do not possess. You walked into the fire when you could have walked away." As they prepared to return to the village, one of Habib's lieutenants approached with a radio message. After listening to the transmission, his expression became grave. "Commander, there are reports of American helicopters approaching from the south. A full battalion with air support." Sarah felt her heart skip. The cavalry was coming, but their arrival might undo everything she had accomplished. If coalition forces engaged the Taliban fighters while she was still in their company, the fragile peace she had negotiated could collapse instantly. "How long?" Habib asked his lieutenant. 20 minutes, perhaps 30. Habib looked at Sarah with something approaching regret. "It seems our time for talk is ending, Dr. Chen." It doesn't have to, Sarah said quickly. Come down to the village with me. When the helicopters arrive, let me explain what happened here. Let me tell them that you honored your word and protected the civilians. Several of Habib's fighters exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of entering a village that would soon be surrounded by American forces. But Habib seemed to be considering the proposal seriously. You would speak for us? He asked. Even though we have killed your soldiers? I would speak for what happened here today, Sarah replied. I would speak for the fact that we proved it's possible to choose healing over violence. The descent to the village took 15 minutes, during which Sarah could hear the sound of approaching helicopters growing louder. By the time they reached the edge of Coast Mountain, 2 Apache gunships were visible on the horizon, followed by what looked like at least 4 transport helicopters carrying troops. The villagers had already gathered in the center of the settlement, uncertain whether the approaching aircraft represented rescue or a new threat. Haji Abdul approached Sarah and Habib as they entered the village together, his eyes wide at seeing the Taliban commander walking peacefully alongside the American doctor. They came for you, he said to Sarah. Your people, they came to bring you home. I know, Sarah replied, but first we need to make sure everyone understands what happened here today. The helicopters landed in the flat area just outside the village, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Sarah could see fully armed Marines deploying in tactical formation, preparing for a combat situation that no longer existed. She needed to reach them before someone made a mistake that would ruin everything. Commander Habib, she said, turning to face the Taliban leader, I need you to have your men lay down their weapons and remain visible. No sudden movements, no defensive positions. The Marines need to see that this is a peaceful situation. Habib nodded and spoke rapidly to his fighters in Pashto. One by one, they placed their weapons on the ground and stood with their hands clearly visible. It was an extraordinary act of trust, given that they were now surrounded by superior forces with overwhelming firepower. Colonel Martinez emerged from the lead helicopter, his face a mixture of relief and confusion as he spotted Sarah walking toward him alongside a group of Taliban fighters. Behind him, 24 Marines maintained defensive positions, their weapons ready but not immediately threatening. Dr. Chen, Martinez called out as she approached. Are you injured? Are these fighters holding you hostage? No, sir, Sarah replied clearly. These men honored an agreement to protect the village civilians in exchange for medical treatment. They kept their word and I kept mine. Martinez looked past Sarah to where Habib and his fighters stood waiting, then back to the village where the civilians were watching nervously. Doctor, I need you to step away from those fighters and let us handle the situation. Colonel, please listen to me, Sarah said urgently. Something important happened here today. These people chose peace over violence. If we respond with force now, we'll destroy something that could be a model for how conflicts can be resolved. For several tense minutes, the 2 groups faced each other across the dusty ground outside Coast Mountain. Armed Marines, Taliban fighters, Afghan villagers, and 1 American doctor who had somehow managed to bring them all together in an arrangement that defied conventional military logic. Finally, Colonel Martinez made a decision that would be debated in military academies for years to come. Instead of ordering the arrest of the Taliban fighters, he walked forward to meet Sarah and Commander Habib in the space between the 2 forces. Commander, he said formally to Habib, I'm told you've agreed to safe passage for these civilians in exchange for medical treatment. That is correct, Habib replied in careful English. Dr. Chen fulfilled her part of the agreement. I will fulfill mine. Martinez looked around at the village, taking in the faces of people who had survived another day because of the extraordinary courage of one doctor and the unexpected honor of their former enemies. Then I suggest we all keep our agreements, he said finally. 3 months later, Sarah Chen received the Medal of Honor for her actions in Coast Matun, though she always insisted that the real heroes were the villagers who had risked everything to help save 3 lives. The story of what happened in that remote Afghan village became a powerful example of how individual acts of courage and compassion could transcend the boundaries of where Commander Habib eventually returned to his engineering studies, later helping to design the new school that was built to replace the one destroyed in the fighting. The village of Coast Matun became a symbol of how former enemies could work together for the benefit of innocent civilians. And Sarah Chen continued her work in war zones around the world. carrying with her the lesson she had learned in the mountains of Afghanistan, that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary, and that healing will always be more powerful than hatred if you're brave enough to walk into the fire.